All right, welcome everybody. I'm Eve Samples. I'm Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades. Welcome to our clean water conversation about Biscayne Bay. I'm going to introduce you to our guests here in just a minute, but first I want to talk a little bit about our clean water conversations. Friends of the Everglades started doing these after COVID hit and shut everything down back in March. And we were really encouraged and continue to be by your appetite and interest to stay tuned into environmental issues, even as there's so much competing for our attention in the world right now. So we're going to continue this conversation today. We're focused on a different part of the greater Everglades ecosystem than we have in the past. Biscayne Bay, I think it's been the most visually dramatic story of this year in terms of ecological harm. There was a big fish kill, very visible fish kill in Biscayne Bay. And we have several guests who are going to tell us a little more about that. And just a quick caveat here. I've told folks that we are going to make this discussion much more robust and interesting than last night's presidential debate. So I think we have like a pretty low bar and we're definitely going to exceed expectations. So I'm happy to do that. And I just want to say welcome to everybody who's watching us on Facebook. If you submit your questions and comments on Facebook, we will get through as many of those as we can today. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guests who we're going to spend the next hour with. The first is Rachel Silverstein. She joined Miami Waterkeeper back in 2014 as Executive Director and Waterkeeper. And she's really been a leading voice in terms of the response to the Biscayne Bay fish kill this summer. If you were on Instagram, you saw Rachel posting updates, sharing information on all different platforms, really, and coordinating the community response to that really dramatic and alarming event that we saw coming. And we're going to talk about that today. So welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Absolutely. And Phil Kushlan is an avid boater. He's spent a lot of time in Biscayne Bay. He's done research and restoration related to Miami's corals. And he is also the president of Friends of the Everglades Board of Directors. So our board here, this is the first time we've had a board member, and we actually have two today, on one of our clean water conversations. We're excited to hear from Phil about why the Biscayne Bay has reached a tipping point and what we can do about it. Welcome, Phil.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having the idea of focusing this on Biscayne Bay.
Absolutely. We talk a lot about the northern ecosystem at Friends of the Everglades because we've had visible issues there, and this is a great opportunity to talk about the South. And finally, Camila Quaresma-Sharp, welcome. Camila is on the board of directors of Friends of the Everglades as well, and she's on the board of the Coconut Grove Chamber of Commerce, where she founded and chairs the Sustainability and Resources Committee, or Resilience Committee, rather. And she's also on the Environment Committee for the Women's Club of Coconut Grove and the Steering Committee for the Biscayne Bay Marine Health Summit, which you're going to hear a little bit more about today. Welcome, Camila.
Thank you. Hi, everybody.
Hi. So I think in order to talk about what happened in Biscayne Bay this summer, we have to look at some of the visuals. And I just want to issue a warning for anyone who has grabbed a sandwich to watch this conversation, because some of these images are really unappetizing. So we're going to pull those up right now. And Rachel, I'd like to ask you to describe the scope of the fish kill that unfolded this summer in Biscayne Bay. How widespread was it? And how much marine life was impacted, and how did the community respond?
Yeah, so we had a busy summer. It was both expected and unexpected at the same time. On August 10th, our team that was out sampling to do our weekly water quality monitoring saw at Morningside Park several dozen dead fish, much like this photo that you're showing here. And that was quickly followed by reports from local swimmers that there were actually hundreds, if not thousands, of dead fish just offshore in the seagrass. And then it was quickly followed by what ended up being dozens and dozens of reports with photos and videos like this from across northern Biscayne Bay. Sort of having an epicenter around Morningside Park. We have a map, which I think you're going to show as well, where we actually compiled all of the citizen reports of the fish kill locations and put them into a map. Here it is. All these red dots are the locations where dead fish were reported. And as far as we can tell, and researchers who have studied Biscayne Bay for decades, this was an unprecedented fish kill in terms of the size and the scope of the wildlife that were affected. And you can see this is the area sort of north of Government Cut and Julia Tuttle and north in Biscayne Bay. And each of these red points represents a location where we received a report, but each red point actually is, most of them are comprised of multiple reports, just to give you a scope of how many of these reports we were getting and how many fish were in each one of these reports. Shortly thereafter, a few days later, the active fish kill lasted from about August 10th to the 15th, and we started to get reports on subsequent days of fish struggling and gasping for air at the surface, which I think you showed a picture of many stingrays gathered together in one location. So we got reports like this of, hundreds of stingrays at the surface showing unusual behavior, gasping for air. We have videos of barracudas gasping, puffer fish, all sorts of other wildlife really struggling. And this really supported what we believed had caused the fish kill, which is the low oxygen levels in the water, or what we call low dissolved oxygen levels. And this happens when you have too much nutrient pollution getting into the water. And nutrient pollution comes from things like septic tanks, from sewage leaks, from stormwater runoff, and from fertilizer overuse. And when that gets into waters like Biscayne Bay or other places around Florida that are estuaries or mixes of fresh and salt water where they're very productive seagrass waste habitats, it fertilizes the microscopic algae that lives in the water and brings a lot of bacteria. And the algae bloom out of control, and the water turns green, it smells bad, and that plus too much bacteria can actually use up all the available oxygen in the water and mean that there's not enough left for the fish and other wildlife. And then overnight, this usually happens overnight when the plants aren't creating more oxygen, you cross a threshold and all the oxygen's used up in the environment and everything literally suffocates overnight. And you can get releases of hydrogen sulfide gas, and a lot of people were reporting really strong smells of sulfur while this was going on too. And so in kind of an emergency attempt to save rays like this in this picture, the Frost Museum went out to Pelican Harbor where this was taken and brought some aeration devices to get emergency oxygen to those rays. We called the Port of Miami, and they were able to deploy one of their fire boats to this area in North Bay Village where we got lots of reports of fish congregating and struggling to breathe. And we also talked to the city of Miami, and they were able to deploy some stormwater pumps to bring emergency oxygen into the water too. And that helped in two ways. Both it mixed the water and it put more oxygen into it. But these are really just life support measures, and we never want to have to do this again. And this was really, the idea was to create a few safe zones or refugia where the wildlife could just find somewhere to breathe until the conditions changed. But this isn't changing the fundamental water quality issues that we have in Biscayne Bay. And to do that, we really need to address the pollution. And a few days after we saw the end of the really acute fish kill at about August 15th, or a few days later, we started to see the really severe algae blooms forming. And if you click forward a little bit, we did put out a call to people to help clean up the fish and get them out of the water. And you saw some pictures of, it was unbelievable response from the public, both in reporting the fish kill, but also in being willing to go out and pick up rotting fish. Because if you leave the fish in the water, they start to decay and decompose. That puts more nutrient pollution into the water, and you end up with algae blooms like this, which are more common in other places around Florida, although they're not normal anywhere. And these fish kills are more common in other places around Florida, but again, they're not normal and they shouldn't be happening. But we heard a lot, oh, this is just a normal summertime fish kill for Florida, or a normal algae bloom for Florida. And we've become so accustomed to living with this high level of pollution in many of our waterways that we're now too used to seeing fish kills, and we're too used to seeing algae blooms like this. So we really did have an overwhelming response from the community, willing to go out and help to clean up and to report. And for that, we're grateful. And we've now started really coordinating really closely with scientists and members of the community to try to find solutions to make sure this never happens again.
Right. I mean, I think if anyone looks at these pictures and says it's normal, they're either lying or they've been so desensitized to pollution in Florida that it's a real problem.
Yeah.
And quick follow-up for you, Rachel. The image of the stingrays, and I'll go back to it, is just so dramatic. Do you know if most of those rays and other fish there ended up dying?
So from what we found, the Frost Museum was able to get out and bring emergency oxygen to these rays specifically. And I think they found that most of them did survive. And the places where the aeration happened, initial data, it's not perfect data because this wasn't like a totally planned experiment. It was an emergency deployment. But from the anecdotal data that we do have, it does seem like the aeration methods helped, at least only in the exact areas where they were deployed and for the time that they were deployed. But it does seem like it may have saved all of these rays to have that additional oxygen. But in the future, what we really need to do is to make sure we're not having too much algae, that we have healthy seagrass communities, because seagrass also produce a lot of oxygen. And what we know is that Biscayne Bay, and particularly this part of Biscayne Bay, here's a great image of it, has lost over 80% of its seagrass in just a few years. So the image on the left, the dark area above the Julia Tuttle Causeway, is all of our seagrass in 2011. By 2016, over 80% of it had disappeared. That means that the seagrass holds the sediment or the bottom of the bay in place, and means that we have beautiful clear water. We have habitat for fish and other wildlife to live in. When we lose the seagrass, the soil starts to dissipate and get suspended. We have cloudy water. We have nutrients released from the soil also. And we have less oxygen being produced and less habitat for fish and wildlife to live in. So it is not a coincidence that we've lost the seagrass in the same area where we saw this fish kill. And this is also an area where we know and have known for years has an extremely high buildup of nutrient pollution from sewage, from septic, from stormwater, and from overuse of fertilizer.
Right. So you just pointed to some really important causes of nutrient pollution in Biscayne Bay, and none of these causes should have been a surprise. You guys at Miami Waterkeeper have been sounding the alarm for years. You've been out there talking about septic and sewer issues for years. The Biscayne Bay Task Force, convened by the County Commission, met 18 times and got 35 presentations on this. And yet we're still at a point where there's not even a fertilizer ordinance in Miami-Dade County yet, and we're hoping to see that change. So I do want to circle back to some of those potential solutions, but we'll pause at that for now because I want to zoom out of it, because the Everglades is such a big ecosystem. And Phil, I was hoping you'd talk a little bit about how Biscayne Bay and the nutrient pollution we've seen there compares to what we see in the northern estuary. Lake Okeechobee also has been the source and has contained toxic algae blooms. So how do you see what's happening in Biscayne Bay as different from the rest of the ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. And that word different, it kind of gets to the heart of why, I was so happy that we're using this Friends of the Everglades forum to talk about the Bay. Because the pollution issues involved in Everglades restoration and that are affecting the Bay are slightly different. And we've talked about the fact that, sometimes policymakers will use that distinction to try to muddy the waters and shift blame and focus. So I'm really glad that we have this forum here to sort of talk about the distinction in the nutrient issues. And I should say that even though, they are slightly different, the solutions for the Bay and for the Everglades, or at least the pathway to the solutions, are the same. It's going to take grassroots advocacy, putting pressure on policymakers, and ultimately creating the political will to implement these solutions. So, basically the story for the estuaries and for the Everglades, and also, some parts to the southern end of the Bay, are a little bit different from the northern end of the Bay in that it's not so much being influenced by local pollution sources, things like septic, things like lawn fertilizer runoff, stormwater runoff. For the Everglades and the estuaries, the story with nutrients really is all about agriculture. And, so we all know that the water flow in Florida comes from the north to the south, basically starting from just south of Orlando, coming through all these agricultural areas and coming into Lake Okeechobee. And Lake Okeechobee is really the key to water management in South Florida. It's a municipal water source for some local communities, but on a much larger level. That's the water that's being used for Everglades restoration, and that's the water that's being used by the sugar industry to irrigate their fields in the Everglades agricultural area south of the lake. And so what's happening in the lake, not only do you have sort of this constant flow of nutrients from the north, but you've got what's called legacy pollution, the result of just decades and decades of dumping pollution into the lake. And so it's not uncommon at all to have algae blooms in the lake in the summer. It's expected at this point. And particularly what we've seen lately are these blooms of what's called toxic blue-green algae, which I'm sure many people who are watching this are aware of and have heard of. And so in an ideal world, what would happen is that water would be shuttled south through our management system, through what are called treatment marshes, which suck the nutrients out, to the point where the water would be clean enough by the time it hits the Everglades, below 10 parts per billion phosphorus, that we can maintain this unique sawgrass ecosystem and not have this phase shift transition to being dominated by cattails. And there are two sort of main issues that are sort of getting in the way of that ideal scenario. The first is that we really don't have enough treatment marsh in the system. We don't have enough marsh to adequately clean the amount of water that we need to be sending into the Everglades. And that's a problem that's going to get worse once this 23-foot deep reservoir being built on the southern end of the system comes online. The plan right now only includes about a third of the amount of treatment marsh that would be needed to adequately treat the capacity that reservoir can hold. So that's an issue that's going to be worse in the future that we need to keep an eye on. The other issue is that because the sugar industry is reliant on this Lake Okeechobee water for its irrigation, the Army Corps has a history of keeping the lake level relatively high, basically to ensure that the sugar industry will have every bit of irrigation water they could possibly want or need in the event of a dry year. And the problem with that is that we can't predict how much rainfall we're going to get in South Florida, and there are years that we just get dumped on. And so if you're holding the lake level high and you get dumped on, the Herbert Hoover Dike, it was finished to its current state around the 1960s. If you get dumped on with a high lake level, the Army Corps has no choice but to send the water east and west. And that's essentially what happened in 2018. Even though we knew there was toxic algae in the lake, they didn't have a choice. They had to send the water out there, and we obviously saw the sort of devastation to those coastal communities. And so that's sort of the big picture in terms of nutrients in the Everglades and estuaries. And again, the big distinction between that and what's happening in the northern end of the bay is it's not so much about these local pollution sources, not so much about septic or lawn fertilizer. It really is about agriculture, and not even just the nutrients that agriculture is putting into the system, which obviously is hugely impactful, but also the historic influence that the agricultural industry has had on the way that water is managed in general.
That's great context, and it is such a massive system, unlike any other in the world, that I'm glad you explained it. And I think the key is restoring some semblance of that river of grass, even though we'll never see it as it once was, as our founder at Friends of the Everglades, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, described it. So I do want to show a pretty picture of Biscayne Bay here, because it can get pretty depressing looking at some of the dead fish. But this is what it should look like. And I'll just leave it on this rainbow picture for a minute so we can all enjoy it. Phil, I'm going to circle back to you in a minute, but Camila, I want to ask you about this town hall meeting focused on Biscayne Bay that you've helped organize. Tell us about what's coming up and what everyday Floridians, Miamians can do to weigh in on this issue.
So everything started with the summit. In 2017, I volunteered with the first summit. Luis Rodriguez, who is the founder, is a very good friend of mine. And once I started getting involved with different environmental organizations, I realized there's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's so many things going on that anybody can help somehow, right? And Luis, when we were talking about it, he said that the summit, the creation of the summit was actually to work as a hub, to be able to get all the one place where all the sectors could meet up and bring their perspective, their data, their opinions. And on this case was all about Biscayne Bay. So after the 2017 summit, I was invited to be part of the steering committee. And from that summit, also Commissioner Rebecca Souza realized the critical state of the Biscayne Bay, the Bay, and proposed to the creation of the County Biscayne Bay Task Force, right? And then we had the 2019 Action Summit. And from there, the task force was already working on putting the report together, and it came out. And finally, this report was approved last month. So the steering committee, we decided that we wanted to bring that information out. So in this case, Friday town hall, we will have different speakers focusing on the immediate and short-term items of the recommendation and showing what's going on, what has been done, and how can people help. So mainly that's our goal. We are also—
Camila, this Friday at what time?
It starts at 10. It's from
Okay,
10 to 12.
we will 10 to 12 this Friday at town hall on the same issue, and we'll post that information in our chat.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
So I really, hope that people come out of the event saying, hey, I could help with this, or, oh, I like that. Or, we will have many topics of interest. So hopefully people can just connect with it and say, oh, I'm able to help with this. I can do this, and take those actions, and let's make it happen, because it's urgent. We need it. And there's a lot going on. So it's a great opportunity to educate yourself with how could you help.
That's very well put, and it's been urgent for many years. We do have a little bit of breaking news to announce right now. So on October 6th, the fertilizer ordinance will be on the agenda of the Miami-Dade Board of County Commissioners, finally, very overdue. And we actually will be posting a link where folks can fill out a form voicing support for that. And that links straight to the Miami Waterkeeper's website, which has really been a leader on this issue. So Rachel, I know a fertilizer ordinance won't solve this problem, but tell us how it will help.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as Phil very eloquently described, nutrient pollution is coming from the same sources, but in sort of different amounts. So in northern Biscayne Bay, where it's distinct from in large parts of the Everglades ecosystem, the water that's getting into Biscayne Bay from the canal system is most directly coming from urban runoff. As the water's moving through neighborhoods that have dense septic tank concentrations and industrial runoff, stormwater outfalls, and lots of sewage leaks. And down in southern Biscayne Bay, we actually have much more influence of agricultural nutrient pollution. That's more similar to what's going on around Lake Okeechobee. But I think the Little River area, for example, is really popping out, and the data is showing that it is very rich in nutrient pollution, unfortunately. And we had very, very high flows from that area going into Biscayne Bay this year in particular. So we're still looking at those interactions too. But we, again, as I mentioned, the four major sources of nutrient pollution: septic, sewer, stormwater, and fertilizer overuse. We need desperately to invest in infrastructure to fix the stormwater, the sewer, and the septic. But kind of the first step that we can take to at least start reducing the amount of nutrient pollution that's getting into our waterways is to enact a strong fertilizer ordinance. And this is for residential fertilizer use. And we've been working for years researching fertilizer ordinances from around Florida. And we are very happy that this is going to go forward on the county agenda very soon, and we need everybody's support for it. We've worked specifically with the North Bay Village, Isla Mirada, the city of Miami, village of Key Biscayne, West Miami, on enacting strong fertilizer ordinances at those cities, but at the county level, we can really make a big impact. And the tenets of a strong fertilizer ordinance, the most important thing to have is a blackout period in the summer to not use fertilizer from about May to September. And that is when it is so rainy in South Florida that almost as soon as you put the fertilizer on the ground, it's rained. And before the plants can even absorb it, it's becoming pollution and going down a storm drain or into a canal and getting into the water. So the really studies have shown that the most impactful thing we can do is to stop using fertilizer for those months in the summer. The other thing we can do is to have a buffer zone around waterways and storm drains of about 15 to 20 feet, because any excess fertilizer you put on the ground is going to run right off and end up as water pollution instead of helping your yards. Also, because it's so rainy, the plants really aren't using the fertilizer during the summer, so it's a waste of time and money for you. So this is a win-win-win ordinance. It is not going to affect your landscaping. You're still going to have a beautiful yard and beautiful lawn, but we're going to have less pollution in the water. So we want to thank Commissioner Levine Cava and Commissioner Higgins for co-prime sponsoring this important ordinance and for really bringing this forward in a very strong way. We are thrilled with how this ordinance is looking, and we really hope that it passes, and we really need everybody's support because this is going to be low-hanging fruit. Let's get this done. Let's get the fertilizer reduced in our waterways to prevent fish kills and algae blooms in the future. And then we can also work really hard on getting some of the infrastructure improvements that we need to help this problem also.
Absolutely. More than 130 other local governments across the state have already passed fertilizer ordinances, some of them many years ago, more than 5 at least. So this is overdue, and we do applaud county commissioners for finally taking it up and hope to see for a good outcome on the 6th. I want to circle back to Phil. Phil, some of your research that you've done has focused on climate change and warming sea temperatures, water temperatures. And I know this came up with regards to the die-off in Biscayne Bay this summer, and I'm just wondering how people can think about warmer temperatures and the role that they played on the fish kill we saw.
Yeah, so that's kind of a tricky question, right? Because as is the case in a lot of these type of severe environmental crises, it's usually a combination of factors that are, working synergistically, and they just push the system over the tipping point. And so, that's certainly what happened in this case. Number one, the bay is overloaded with nutrients and has been for a long time, and that's sort of this constant background pressure on our, seagrass and coral reef communities. Number two, we are seeing, seasonally these gradually increasing temperatures of just warmer and warmer and warmer summers. And that's unquestionably due to, global climate change. And there are a number of other factors that happen. Rachel mentioned the fact that the seagrass die-off that had already occurred meant that there was lower oxygen already in that area. And if you remember back to 2-3 weeks before the fish kill, it had been really, really still on the bay. If you had been out there at all, it was just this still oppressive heat. There are no storms coming through, and so it's likely that that also played a big factor in forming a thermocline, so that the water wasn't mixing. And so all of these factors are sort of coming together to cause the crisis. And so it's hard to get a clean message on that. And I think maybe the best way to think about it is in terms of level of control. What can we do to address this problem? Can we do anything about the wind? Not really, right? They sent those fire boats out there to stir up the water. And it was good to show the public the urgency, and I'm sure in those local areas it did have an impact. But obviously that's not something you can do bay-wide. Climate change, can we do anything about that? Yes, but that's a global issue. It's going to take global solutions, a global will to get to those solutions. There's stuff we can do locally here in South Florida and Miami. We can, promote green energy, promote things like mass transit, support politicians who appreciate and understand the threat that climate change, really is to South Florida. But there's only so much we can do on a local level. So, what's left? It's the nutrients. the nutrients are what we can address now to take care of this problem, with things like these ordinances. And if we don't do that, that underlying problem is still going to be there like a ticking time bomb every single summer. Until we fix the nutrient problem, this fish kill could happen sort of at any time. So I think that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, the warmer waters almost certainly were a cause, but they weren't the only cause. And they aren't, as Rachel said, the low-hanging fruit, the cause that we can most readily address now.
Thanks, Phil. Very well articulated. Did you want to add something, Rachel?
Yeah, just to add on to what Phil said, I think Phil's exactly right in saying that whenever we see crises, whether in the environment or in other arenas, it's usually the result of several factors coming together. And what is key here to understand is that we have had exceptionally hot weather. We're like breaking records left and right, and hotter water holds less oxygen, making us more vulnerable to having low dissolved oxygen events like what caused the fish kill. But the fact that we are at a tipping point for pollution means that when the water does get hot, we don't have a buffer to allow the ecosystem to absorb any additional stress. So when the water gets hot, or we have low winds, or a lot of flow coming out of the little river, for example, we just can't absorb that stress because we're already pushed to the limit with pollution. So if you take away the pollution from the equation, we probably would not have had the fish kill in the first place. So it puts us in a very vulnerable position to be sort of teetering on the edge of this tipping point, which is something that NOAA scientists pointed out and even in 2015, they designated Biscayne Bay as a habitat focus area. And this is one of 10 locations around the world that they identified as places of high environmental and economic value that were on a tipping point for some sort of change. And specifically, Biscayne Bay was chosen to be at a tipping point for nutrient pollution. And they published a study last year. At the same time, the grand jury report came out from the state attorney's office saying Biscayne Bay is at a tipping point. The same time the Biscayne Bay Task Force was initiated, NOAA was publishing science showing that the nutrient levels were sky high in this part of the bay and predicted that we would have a fish kill, specifically out of that research. So it was almost exactly a year before the fish kill actually happened. And this goes back even before last year and before 2015, back to the 1940s. We have articles, and you can check out our blog. We wrote a whole blog about an article that came out in Look magazine in 1949 about the contamination of Biscayne Bay and the septic tanks contamination of Biscayne Bay. 1970, we had the federal government, before we had an EPA, they came down and they did a whole study on pollution of the waters of Miami-Dade County then. The number one thing that they said was we have to get rid of the septic tanks. We shouldn't give any new permits for septic tanks. And that turned into $500 million that the federal government gave Miami-Dade County to make our 3 sewage treatment plants that we have today and to get rid of all the septic tanks. We built the sewage treatment plants, but we never got rid of the septic tanks. And now our sewage treatment plants are over 50 years old too, and they also need to be updated, not only for sea level rise, which is making things much worse, but they're also at the end of their planned life. So we have lots of investments we need to be making to continue to be able to live here.
That's really fascinating and disheartening. And we have a Facebook question that's come in related to a sewer, and I want to get to that. But I also want to circle back on your point about the tipping point for Biscayne Bay. And I think what Biscayne Bay experienced this summer really feels similar to what the northern estuaries experienced in 2018, when we had those extremely visible blue-green algae cyanobacteria blooms threatening the health of residents and, of course, marine life. And as awful as that was for everyone who was near it, and I was here then, it also created urgency to respond, and I'm hopeful that that's what we're seeing now in Biscayne Bay, and the fertilizer ordinance action is one piece of evidence that maybe that's happening, but we can't let up, right? The bay is looking better now. I know near Morningside Park, it was beautiful just recently. So let's remember, as hard as these pictures are to look at, and I'm gonna pull some of them back up, they're really important to remember. So,
yeah, and I just add that, that was 2018. That was an election year. And it was an issue that candidates were asked about, that the public was really angry and fired up about. And, I think as a result of that, we have seen some progress. The formation of this blue-green algae task force, the reservoir plan has its problems, but it's moving forward. So, good things have come from that. And, I think that this being an election year, hopefully, there's never a good time for something like this to happen. But hopefully, this is something that politicians, especially down here in Miami, need to be thinking about and answering for.
right. People ask what they can do, and certainly supporting the fertilizer ordinance is one thing, but voting is another. And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that right now and a month before the election. So the question that I mentioned about sewer is from a viewer named Jenny Davis Lensher, and she wanted to know what happened to the money and the promise to redirect sewer lines out in the ocean. So are you able to speak to that? And I'm sorry we hid your face, Rachel.
That's okay.
I'm sharing my screen now so we can see you again.
No, that's no problem. Yeah, I can a little bit. I wish I could answer it more because I wish there was a better plan. But essentially what I think this question is referring to is the fact that we have 3 sewage treatment plants in Miami-Dade County, and those sewage treatment plants collect waste from properties. They partially treat the waste, and then it's sent out of what's called the open ocean outfall that goes 3 miles out and about 100 feet deep. And then it discharges the waste. And it's been found that those pipes, while they're technically sanitized and they shouldn't have any living bacteria or viruses in them, they're full of nutrients and other, what I like to call nasties, that are really hard to get rid of in the treatment process. So this is like, although a small amount of the constituents in waste, like 0.0 whatever percent, that's like the most harmful stuff that's really hard to get out. So that's being discharged out into the ocean. In 2008, the state government passed a law saying that by 2025, those had to be shut down, and we had to reuse 60% of the wastewater. And other counties around Florida that also have this ocean outfall system have taken action on this and shut down their outfalls. Miami-Dade County has not. And to my knowledge, we don't have a comprehensive plan yet for how we're going to do that. But my thought is that it seems like we're moving towards doing deep well injection and injecting the partially treated waste into the boulder zone, which has its own issues. And I don't see a plan for being able to meet the 60% reuse of wastewater requirement. And we were actually hoping that it might be able to be used, treated to a high enough level, of course, that it wouldn't harm the environment or people, to rehydrate and add more water to our coastal wetland systems that definitely need more fresh water. But it seems like that's also not moving forward at the moment either. So we've been working really closely with the county on this issue on wastewater reuse. We actually did an economic study to value what it would mean for Biscayne Bay to have this additional fresh water that we desperately need, because as we know from the Everglades system, where parts of it have too much fresh water at certain times, parts of the water is too dirty, and the thing is that we need to clean fresh water to get to the right places at the right times of year and rehydrate the right systems. And for Biscayne Bay, we really only have the Biscayne Bay Coastal Wetlands Project as part of SERP that touches bringing fresh water to Biscayne Bay. And they've done phase 1, which is to bring what was a canal into the Deering estate area and to rehydrate a bunch of wetlands there. It's been successful to some degree. We have otters that have moved in there now, but ultimately they found that what we really need is a new source of fresh water and more fresh water to be coming through there to reach the restoration goals that they've outlined. So that is now in the process of being examined for phase 2. But like much of the Everglades, because of how we engineered and replumbed the system, we're not getting enough fresh water in the right places.
Rachel, there's a related question for you on Facebook. What are the treatment levels used in Miami wastewater treatment plants? Primary, secondary, or tertiary? Please clarify the difference between these 3.
Oh my goodness. I'm going to get this confused. So I can research this and get back to it. I know our general counsel, Kelly Cox, is going to be mad at me for not knowing the answer to that. But
No worries.
I'm going to get this backwards.
We can't keep it all in our heads. That's right. So Luis Rodriguez asked that question. We will circle back on that. And Camila, I want to return to you because I think a lot of people who are interested in the environment in Florida don't have the time to cultivate the level of expertise that Rachel has, that Phil has. And you've come to this as a resident and a volunteer. And I think that if you could share a little bit about why you devote so much of your personal time to this issue, it would be really valuable.
I think I always be an environmentalist without knowing. I think being outdoors is what makes me feel the best in my life. And I guess my tip is getting connected with local environmental groups really help. And this is how I started when I decided to change my life a few years ago and really commit most of my time to environmental issues. This is basically what I did. You know, I got involved with local community activities and groups, and then I was invited to participate. There's definitely a lot going on that needs help. You know, and here we have Friends of the Everglades and Miami Waterkeepers that are two amazing organizations that is able to give a lot of resources for people to start. It's really, I think, so basically this is how I started, you know, and I feel very blessed and grateful that I was able to connect with all these people and being working in all these projects. I'm usually not the one up front talking and doing things. I'm always on the backstage, organizing, helping, making things happen. So there is a need in so many levels. You know, a lot of people think you need to know so much, or I'm back in school because my passion just took me to go back to school, and I'm at FIU finishing my degree in sustainability and the environment. And but I mean, there's so many ways you can do, you know, and it's important to everybody to think that it makes such a big difference when you have individual actions too, because every single person choice, everyday choice makes a big difference in all this that we're talking about. It's from refusing single-use plastic, it's from recycling, it's from, you know, calling the commissioners and really going after just one email or half hour of your day, connecting with them and telling them what it's important to you. So for instance, now with the confirmation with the fertilizers ordinance to be on the agenda for October 6th, it's so important that everybody takes some time and send a message to their commissioners saying, listen, I urge you to please approve this. We need it. It's for yesterday. So there are all these little details that we can do to help. And that's what it helped me keep going and loving it and wanting to protect even more, because that's what, for me, it's so important, you know? So I guess that's what I would say.
That's great, Camila. And you just reminded me that I need to share that this morning, Friends of the Everglades sent a letter to Miami-Dade's Mayor Jimenez, as well as the county commissioners on this issue in Biscayne Bay, calling on them to take action with regards to fertilizer, sewage, septic, wastewater, all the things we've been talking about today. We're going to share that letter with folks who follow Friends of the Everglades, as well as the link to support the fertilizer ordinance. We'll be emailing that out. And to your point, Camila, we want to make it easy for people to engage on these issues. We want to make it understandable, and it's really important to translate the science, which is also vitally important, into layman's terms so that we can all take action and let elected officials know that this is vitally important for the future. And Camila, I know you're a mom, I'm a mom, and this work can feel so incremental. And I've come to just think about it multi-generationally. So my son is 12, almost 12, and maybe I'll be able to have a beer with him by the time we see like really meaningful Everglades restoration. So it's just long-term work, and we've got to stick with it.
Yes, very true.
We have some more questions coming in from Facebook, so I'm going to wade through some of these. We actually have a question here from Jackie Thurlow-Lippish. She's a member of the governing board of the South Florida Water Management District. Historically, Biscayne Bay received much more water via the southeast flowing Everglades through the Peat and Marl transverse glades. And you can really see how it's disconnected on the map we were showing earlier. development and drainage change this? Do you think water input could be part of the issue? Rachel, you touched on this earlier. Do you want to circle back?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two major issues affecting Biscayne Bay. One is water quality. That's some of the pollution issues that we've covered today. The other is water quantity, and that we are simply not getting enough fresh water into Biscayne Bay anymore. And Biscayne Bay is often a little bit left out of the Everglades restoration conversations because there just isn't that much undeveloped land anymore to do some of these projects. So that's why a lot of the focus has been on the Biscayne Bay Coastal Wetlands Project in southern Biscayne Bay, rather than the areas we're discussing in northern Biscayne Bay. Where we do have a lot of canals in those areas, but not a lot of open space to do some of these key restoration projects. But Biscayne Bay, just like much of the estuaries around Florida and around the world, are so productive because they're a mix of fresh water and salt water. And that means there's specific habitats that develop in those areas, and many species of wildlife like to have their babies in estuaries because it's easy places for to have nurseries and have the baby fish grow up safely. When we don't have enough fresh water getting into Biscayne Bay anymore, the water becomes more the same salinity, particularly in the dry season, as the ocean. And it becomes much more of a marine environment than an estuary environment. And you have a different mix of species. Like we now have a lot of corals growing along, seawalls in Biscayne Bay, where I love corals. My PhD is in corals. I actually went to graduate school with Phil, studying corals and climate change. But, it's more appropriate in some parts of Biscayne Bay to have like oysters, for example, and salt marsh that are more typical of these kinds of estuary environments. So certainly we need more fresh water in Biscayne Bay, in the Biscayne Bay coastal wetland system, in the model lands in the county, for example. FPL Turkey Point's nuclear power plant is putting a lot of salt into the system on the southern end of Biscayne Bay too. That's changing the ecosystem, and that's essentially sandwiched in between Everglades National Park and Biscayne National Park. So that's probably a whole discussion for another hour to talk about what's going on at our friendly neighborhood nuclear power plant. But worth mentioning as well that that's another factor, changing the salinity regimes in southern Biscayne Bay too.
Thanks. We've got another good question. This one's from Kaleem Ali. He asks, will it be possible to restore the seagrass that has been lost? I've heard that it can take a very long time. Phil, Rachel, Camila, what do you think?
It's possible. There are seagrass restoration programs out there. How quickly it can happen, probably in large part, depends on our ability to get conditions back to where they should be. This idea of sort of synergistic effects and downstream effects, really, the salinity affects seagrasses in a massive, massive way. And so I remember Rachel was talking about the idea that the seagrass die-off, you no longer have these grasses, generating oxygen. A large part of that is largely because of the changes we made in the salinity in the bay. And so, all of these things sort of pile on top of each other. And so it's important to think of these as sort of getting the whole system back together.
Yeah, and I would say that seagrass restoration, just like coral restoration and other kinds of environmental restoration, is possible. It's much better to just not destroy it in the first place because it's very expensive and difficult to put it back, and it's never quite as good as what nature made. However, while you can do seagrass restoration in Biscayne Bay, there's probably not too much of a point to do it until we've addressed the reasons that the seagrass was dying in the first place. So if we don't address the nutrient pollution issues that was killing the seagrass, it doesn't make sense to put more seagrass in the bay because it won't survive.
And I just want to show that picture again of the seagrass. If we can pull that up, great. So you can see again the visual of dark area being seagrass in 2011 on the right, just the dearth of it in 2016. And I'm pretty sure it's no better today. But up in the northern end of the system where I am, I'm in Stewart. We've seen seagrass die off too as a result of Lake Okeechobee discharges. And we haven't had Lake Okeechobee discharges for about 2 years. And there have been some encouraging signs, especially back in the drier months, of some regeneration. So it can happen if the conditions are right and we avoid further pollution, to your point, Rachel. So we have to stay hopeful, otherwise we won't be able to keep on. We have a few more questions coming in. So here's one from a viewer named Tico Aran. Traditionally, the fresh water that entered in Biscayne Bay came from as far north as the watershed that feeds the St. Johns River in Jacksonville. Are there any current plans to move more fresh water into North Bay from up north? Lock systems like the ones at Cape Canaveral are a good example. So question about kind of re-engineering the system and whether that can work.
Yeah, so I think Miami-Dade County is actually looking into this, and the Water and Sewer Department, not as far north as Jacksonville, but I think up in Palm Beach County, if I'm not mistaken, they were looking at buying water shares up there, which would give them, you're not physically transferring the water down, but it's all part of the water budget that the district is maintaining and trying to get more flow in this region by doing that. They've also been looking at aquifer storage and recovery, which I think has issues that I'm concerned about too. But again, I think we're missing an opportunity where we're taking, hundreds of millions of gallons of water a day of fresh water out of the system and then letting it go out to sea as wastewater and not looking at sustainable reuse that would be clean to a level that's harmful for the environment, not harmful for people, and takes out all the nasty stuff but leaves the fresh water. It has been proven that it is technologically feasible to treat wastewater to meet Biscayne Bay water quality standards. But it is expensive, and I think that's everybody's hesitation. But that's where our fresh water is going that we need, and we're sending it out to sea.
Mm-hmm. And this is a related question, since you mentioned ASR wells, aquifer storage and recovery, which we at Friends of the Everglades certainly have concerns about.
Yeah.
You mentioned deep well injection earlier when you were talking about sewage plants. Can you talk a little bit about your concerns there? What is the risk when we shoot this water back into the boulder zone?
Yeah, so we have very porous limestone geology here in Florida, which I think a lot of us are familiar with. And that means basically what's happening on the surface is also happening in the groundwater, because it's very easy to transmit water from the surface into the ground. That's a good thing in some respects, but it also means that our groundwater is very, very vulnerable to pollution. And to steal Michael Greenwald's phrasing on this, I really liked how he described our aquifer system as a layer cake. Mm-hmm. And so there are different layers in the system. The one closest that we get our drinking water from is the Biscayne aquifer. It has very high quality water. And then there's layers of boulder zone and other aquifers underneath, and confining layers that the idea is the aquifer layers are very porous and water moves through them, but the boulder zone is supposed to be down so far that it isn't connected to surface water or to any kind of drinking water supply. So the idea is it's kind of like a waste disposal unit if we drill a well really down deep and put anything we don't want from sewage waste to actually Florida Power and Light got permission to put like radioactive waste down there too, which we were concerned about. The concern there is a couple of things. In theory, if everything worked properly, we wouldn't have a contamination risk, but of course there's always the risk of leaking. And we're creating basically giant like hazardous waste storage units underneath our drinking water supply that makes me concerned. There have been incidents in the past where these deep wells have leaked. There's also the question of whether or not there's more connections between the boulder zone and the drinking water layers than we know that it hasn't been totally mapped. And also just fundamentally, we're taking all of this fresh water and instead of cleaning it and reusing it sustainably, we're sticking it in a hole in the ground where it's, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, potentially taken out of the water cycle. And that's not really a sustainable practice long-term, particularly in Florida, where there are, ironically enough, for a state that's like a third covered in fresh water, we have areas that really need more fresh water because of how we've managed the system. So those are my concerns. You guys might have other ones.
No, I mean, a big key is that there's no recovery of it. You know, it's the same thing as dumping it offshore. You're just getting rid of the water. It's not helpful.
I think we've seen over the decades in Florida these over-engineered solutions. They can make some companies a lot of money, but they often have unintended consequences. And if we're not addressing the source of the pollution anyway, they're not going to yield great results for us. So I'm going to take one more question from Facebook, and then I'm going to go around the horn with you all because our time is running short. These always go fast. And I'm going to ask you to offer your parting words in terms of what our viewers can do, what Floridians can do to help Biscayne Bay. So last question. There are a few here for me to choose from. Okay, this is another one from Jackie Thurlow-Lippish. Do you think Miami Beach dealing with sea level rise, draining overflow water into the bay could be affecting seagrass? And I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Yeah, so we can take a stab at that one. Certainly an issue. So basically what's happening is the stormwater system, and stormwater is any water that's falling on the ground that isn't absorbed into the ground that's being collected in storm drains. And normally that would be sent out to the lowest point around, whether that be a canal or the bay, and the water would be discharged there. It's picking up all of the contamination from the ground, anything that's on the streets, pet waste, oil, fertilizers, other kinds of chemicals running down the drain and up in our waterways. So that's a problem from stormwater that it's contaminating, and it's known to have high bacteria levels, high nutrient levels, everything. However, with sea level rise, the water, the end of the pipe is sometimes now not the lowest point around. And the water is actually higher than the end of the outfall pipe. And so the water is actually coming backwards up the storm drain system and ending up in the street. So sometimes in Miami now we have what's called sunny day flooding, which means that there, even without a drop of rain, we have streets that are full of water in high tide because the water's come from the bay and ended up in the street. In order to deal with this, some municipalities, and it is not just Miami Beach, but many other municipalities are doing it too, have pump systems that actually, instead of using gravity to move the water, actually pumping the water off the streets and into bodies of water. This is concentrating all of the contamination that normally gets into stormwater and kind of ejecting it at high speed into a waterway with some treatment, but limited treatment. As we have more and more flooding as climate change and sea level rise gets worse and worse, one of the things we really need to invest in is figuring out how we're going to deal with all this excess water in the street and stormwater, because we can't just be using the bay and our canals as stormwater retention ponds. These are thriving ecosystems with endangered species in them that generate billions of dollars for the local economy, and we're not treating them properly. So I would say stormwater across the whole county is a major problem. We have compliance issues. We need better best management practices, or best management practices at all. We need to be thinking about how to slow the water down and clean it before it gets into our waterways, instead of how to get it off the streets as quickly as possible. And actually, FDEP just released a really interesting document where they looked into this called the Green Infrastructure and Low Impact Development Guide, specifically for South Florida. I'm happy to share that with all the viewers too. That has a lot of suggestions for how to improve stormwater, but certainly we need to be thinking holistically about this and the impact that stormwater is having. And again, Miami Beach was out in front on this with their pump systems, but this is a problem countywide. Other municipalities are using pumps, and stormwater in general is not properly treated. So
thanks, Rachel. So we're going to go around the horn to end this, and we've scratched the surface on a lot of solutions. And if any of you watching want to know more, please go to everglades.org or Miami Waterkeeper's website. There's a lot more information there. And I'm just going to share my screen, and I just have to show one of these alarming images as we go around the horn, because this is what we want to prevent, right? Dead fish, as we saw in August in Biscayne Bay. And Camila, I want to start with you. In 30 seconds or so, what's your parting advice to people who want to help solve this problem?
I think connect with local organizations that already have needs for volunteers. There's always something people can do. I think check it out, Friday's town hall. We're gonna have a lot of information there as well. And again, consider your everyday choices. Get away from single-use plastic, stop using fertilizers when you're not supposed to, recycle, compost, and actually for residents with septic tanks, they should learn about their systems and schedule inspections as required by law and check it out what's going on right there, because we have 120,000 septic tanks in Miami-Dade County that needs to be addressed ASAP as well. I mean, there's so much we can do. So definitely connect with us, connect with the organizations, and then we can, you can map a way to make it happen.
Thank you, Camila. Biscayne Bay Marine Health Summit Town Hall this Friday and County Commission meeting on October 6th, 2 important dates coming up. Phil, what's your parting advice to people who want to help solve this problem?
Yeah, well, I would first of all double down on Camila's points, support advocacy groups that are already out there doing the work. Join Miami Waterkeeper, join Friends of the Everglades. We still have spaces open for our inaugural Marjorie Circle program. Follow us on social media, follow the issues, respond to these action alerts. As you said, get involved in the local politics. If you are burnt out or frustrated by national politics, as I'm sure anyone who watched the debate last night would be, this is where you can make your voice heard. And if you show up there and take 1 minute to make a comment, it makes a difference. They pay attention. And the third thing I would add is just not to focus too much on the gloom and doom and the negativity. If you're constantly reading the press about the Bay, about the Everglades, it's the whole "if it bleeds, it leads" concept. And we need to keep in mind that with all the problems we have, we still have an amazing resource right here in our backyard. So get out there, go camp in Big Cypress, get out on the water, take someone who's never been there before, take photos, put it on social media, and it's just really important to remind people what we have and what we have to save here.
Thanks, Phil. You inspired me to end with a prettier picture, and I'm going to let Rachel have the last word today. Rachel, your advice to people watching.
Yeah, of course. Well, thanks so much for convening this. This has been a great conversation. Lots of ways for people to get involved. Definitely check out, Friends of the Everglades and Miami Waterkeepers website you can get our newsletter. You can become a member. Follow us on social media. We have our 10th anniversary actually is coming up next week. So you can RSVP for our Waves of Change campaign. There's going to be three-part docu-series that we're going to release over the next week. You can sign up to watch those episodes. They're going to be between 10 and 15 minutes each one, telling the past, present, and future of Miami's water story. So if you want to learn more, that's a great education tool and something good to do with the family. We also have a 1,000 Eyes on the Water program. So we made this totally virtual because of COVID. It takes about an hour. We have the training on our website. You can learn to observe, document, and report pollution events that you might see going about your daily life. Even though they might seem small, this is death by 1,000 cuts for the Bay. So you can do your part by making sure that Miami Waterkeeper is aware it can get pollution stopped when it's happening. And please do sign the fertilizer petition. We're going to send out more information tomorrow about how you can speak out and get in touch with our commissioners to support the fertilizer ordinance that's going to be on the agenda. Again, co-prime sponsored by Daniela Levine-Cava and Commissioner Higgins. So definitely check those out. There's always things going on, always ways to get involved, even virtually in these strange times. So thanks again. We look forward to seeing everybody soon.
Thanks, Rachel. So we'll send links to all that information via our newsletter from Friends of the Everglades. If you're not signed up, go to everglades.org, sign up for it. We'll send follow-up on this video, as well as information about Marjorie Circle, which honors our founder, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, which started working on this issue back in the 1940s. So we'll keep at it. We thank you all so much for your time today and look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you.
Thanks.